Welcome back to Conversations about Bookbinding, carefully curated by bookbinding and book restorer Edward Patrick Krantz of Bookforge, right here in Erie, Pennsylvania. Today we're taking you on a deep dive into the world of medieval and early modern bookbinding. You've given us quite the collection of sources, historical texts, scholarly articles, even a blog post from a modern-day bookbinder.
It's an incredible journey, really. It's fascinating to see how these techniques developed and how much we can still learn from them.
Absolutely. So let's start by setting the scene. We have this text about the history of the Malek National Library, and it talks about how bookbinders were seen back then. Any guesses?
I think you're leading us towards the high esteem in which bookbinders were held.
You're right on the money. It actually says, the profession of bookbinders and book coverers is the noblest craft and surpasses other professions. It's like they were rock stars.
It makes you realize how much these books were treasured. They weren't just objects, they were vessels of knowledge painstakingly crafted to last.
And that brings us to what those books actually look like. We have this blog post about medieval binding methods, flat spines, parchment pages, wooden boards, metal clasps. It's a far cry from the paperbacks we toss in our bags today.
You can practically feel the weight of one of these books just thinking about it. And you'd notice something else too, that distinctive wedge shape.
So why the wedge shape? It's not just an aesthetic choice, is it?
Not at all. It's all about the parchment. Parchment is made from animal skin and it reacts to humidity. When the air is damp, it expands, and when it's dry, it contracts.
Ah, so because the spine wasn't rounded like the books were used to, the pages would actually swell outwards, creating that wedge.
Precisely. It's a built-in preservation technique, ensuring the text block wouldn't be damaged as the parchment breathed.
That's incredible. Now, speaking of parchment, let's talk about the materials themselves. Our bookbinding terms booklet goes into some fascinating detail about how parchment was made.
It was no easy feat. We're talking a multi-day process, sometimes up to a week, involving soaking, stretching, and scraping animal skins.
7 days for a single sheet of parchment. That's dedication.
It really highlights the craftsmanship involved. And then there's the leather for the binding, even more specialized techniques there. They used a process called tawing for the sewing supports, which made the leather super strong and resistant to tearing.
I'm sensing a theme here. Durability above all else.
Absolutely. These books were meant to last, but the process wasn't for the faint of heart. Some steps involved, well, let's just say they used every part of the animal.
Okay, I'm definitely curious. Give me a vivid detail, something that really brings this process to life.
All right, you asked for it. To soften the hides, they used a process called baiting, and one of the key ingredients, dog dung.
Dog tongue, you're kidding?
Nope. It might sound strange, but it was a common practice back then. It helped break down the proteins in the skin, making it more pliable.
Okay, that's an image I won't soon forget. Now, moving on from the fragrant world of parchment and leather preparation, let's talk about how they actually put these books together.
This is where the ingenuity of medieval bookbinders really shines. They developed incredibly strong and lasting sewing methods, like all-along sewing, where the thread passes through every single page along the spine.
And the benefit of that is?
Strength, of course. It distributed stress evenly across the spine so the pages wouldn't easily detach. Then there were different lacing patterns for attaching the boards, tunnel lacing outer channels, a combination of the two.
So these lacing patterns weren't just decorative, they had a structural purpose.
Absolutely. Imagine those sewing supports, often made of that tough, taut leather woven through the boards, anchoring the text block securely. That's why so many 15th century books have survived centuries.
It really is remarkable. So we have incredibly durable materials, ingenious sewing, and these robust lacing techniques. And it all adds up to
books built like tanks. But they weren't just sturdy, they were also beautifully crafted with regional variations and styles that are fascinating to explore.
That sounds like the perfect place to pick up in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to Conversations about Bookbinding.
You know, it's amazing to think about those bookbinders meticulously sewing each page, creating these incredibly sturdy books, and then, bam, the printing press comes along and changes everything.
You'd think it would have turned the bookbinding world upside down overnight, but according to the Anderson survey, that wasn't the case.
Really? Why not?
Well, these bookbinders had spent centuries perfecting their craft. Their techniques were proven, and they weren't about to abandon them completely just because there was a new way to produce text.
So they adapted Found ways to blend the old with the new.
Exactly. Take, for instance, the use of parchment guards in early printed books. They would insert these strips of parchment into the spine folds of the paper text block, almost like they were reinforcing a weaker material.
It's as if they couldn't quite trust paper's strength yet.
It's understandable, but over time, as they worked with paper more and more, they realized it was actually quite durable, especially when sewn in multiple layers. Eventually, those parchment guards became unnecessary.
That's a great example of how adaptable these bookbinders were. They were constantly evaluating, refining, innovating. And speaking of innovation, the Anderson survey also dives into some fascinating regional differences in 15th century bookbinding, particularly between Italy and the Netherlands.
Ah, yes, the bookbinding rivalry. It's like each region had its own distinct personality reflected in the way they approached the craft.
So what were some of the key differences?
Well, even the way they prepared the spine for sewing was different. The Netherlands favored a series of slits made with a knife, while in Italy they typically punched round holes.
Interesting. So right from the start, we see different approaches.
And it continues from there. For example, Dutch bindings tended to have more sewing supports than Italian bindings.
More supports, more strength.
Yeah.
That sounds very Dutch to me, practical and built to last.
Exactly. And they weren't afraid to use thicker boards, often shaping them with a gently sloped cushion edge. Imagine running your finger along the edge of a Dutch binding. You'd feel that soft curve.
Whereas Italian bindings tended towards thinner boards with sharper, more defined edges.
Yes, and they often had a beveled inside edge, a subtle detail that added a touch of elegance. It's these little nuances that give each region its unique fingerprint.
So even within a specific historical period, there's this incredible diversity in practice.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about following a set of rules. It was about creative expression, adapting techniques to suit different materials and aesthetics, and that's what makes studying these historical bindings so captivating. You get a glimpse into the minds of these craftsmen, their regional influences, their individual choices.
It's like piecing together a puzzle, each detail, revealing a bit more about the book, the binder, and the time in which it was created. But as fascinating as these historical techniques are, they also present modern-day conservators with some unique challenges.
That's where the Quan article comes in, right? It focuses on the rebinding of a 15th century book of hours, and it really highlights the delicate balance conservators face, preserving the historical integrity of the book while making sure it's still functional.
It's a tough job. They can't just slap on a modern binding.
Exactly. That would be like erasing history. This particular book of hours presented an especially tricky problem, a very stubby text block.
Stubby.
It means the pages are thick in relation to their width, and they're notorious for not wanting to open flat. Imagine trying to read a book where the pages are constantly trying to spring closed.
That sounds frustrating.
Hmm.
So how did they solve this problem? Did they have to compromise on historical accuracy?
Not at all. They got creative and used an unsupported link stitch, which allows for more flexibility in the spine. It's like creating a chain that links the pages together without the rigid structure of traditional sewing supports.
So no cords running along the spine.
Exactly. It's not a technique you see every day, but
Yeah.
it was the perfect solution for this particular book. And they took it a step further, modifying the spine landing technique by attaching it only to the tops of the pages.
Creating little pockets of air between the sections, allowing the pages to move more freely. Brilliant.
It's incredible what modern conservators can achieve blending historical knowledge with modern techniques to preserve these precious objects. And it speaks to a larger point about bookbinding, the constant evolution, the adaptation, the search for solutions that respect the past while looking towards the future.
And speaking of looking towards the future, it's time for us to move on to part 3 of our deep dive. Welcome back to Conversations about Bookbinding. We've been exploring this incredible world of medieval and early modern bookbinding, but I think this next source really brings it home.
You're talking about the text with that inscription from the 15th century Austrian manuscript, right? It's amazing to get such a personal glimpse into the life of a bookbinder from that era.
Exactly. It says, Master Leonard Hamrel from Soprano finished binding this book in the year of our Lord, 1484, on the Friday before St. George's Day. God grant that it may be for the use and good of all.
To think that we know the actual date, even the day of the week that Master Hamrel completed this binding, it's a remarkable connection to the past. And that final line, God grant that it may be for the use and good of all, it really speaks to the bookbinder's sense of purpose.
They weren't just creating objects, they were creating something meant to be used, shared, and cherished for generations. It's a powerful reminder that behind every historical binding, there was a person, a craftsman, an artist.
And it makes you wonder about all the other bookbinders whose names we'll never know, whose stories are lost to time.
Yet their legacy lives on in the books they bound.
Yeah.
Those books are still here, still teaching us, still inspiring us.
Exactly. It's a testament to the skill and care that went into their creation. We might not know their names, but we can appreciate their artistry and dedication every time we hold one of those books in our hands.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage everyone listening, the next time you visit a library or a rare book collection, take a moment to really look at the bindings of those older books.
You'll see those regional differences we talked about, the subtle details, the choices the bookbinder made. And you might even feel a connection to those craftsmen from centuries ago, those who dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge and creating beauty.
It's a legacy worth celebrating. From the durability of medieval techniques to the ingenuity of modern conservation, this deep dive has shown us that bookbinding is more than just a craft. It's an art form, a science, and a vital link to our past.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through the world of bookbinding.
And until next time, keep those conversations about bookbinding alive.